Chapter 1. The Will That Split Blood. They said I inherited a dead field and should take the hush money. My name is Marianne Cole, and 3 years later, that worthless dirt became a freight hub with $42 million in revenue and 1,200 jobs, while a single signature my brother made put 60% of our company in the hands of a fund he never saw coming. In court, they demanded to unmask NorthRock. I stood up and said that would be me, Your Honor. So when family greed tried to crush me, I bought the leverage, took the company, and let the truth do the talking. When money enters the room, love quietly walks out. I learned that in a walnut-paneled office 8 floors above 17th Street in Denver, on a windless afternoon in late September of 2020. The blinds were half open, the light was the color of weak tea, and the clock on the wall made a small ticking sound that felt louder than anyone's breathing. My brother Daniel sat to my left, broad-shouldered in a navy suit that fit like confidence. My sister Lydia crossed one ankle over the other in a silk dress that caught the light every time she moved. Our mother Margaret gripped the handle of her purse with both hands, as if it were the only steady thing left. Across from us, attorney Eric Vaughn opened a folder and cleared his throat. He read what we already suspected our father had been: meticulous, thorough, and impossible to sway. Daniel received 40% of Cole Development Group, the company our grandfather started and our father expanded through 3 recessions. Lydia received the Lakeview house in Cherry Creek and a trust fund of $5 million that would release in tranches. My name came last, Marianne Cole, a parcel of land measuring 68 acres on the eastern edge of Fort Morgan, registered in my name, free and clear. No one spoke. You could hear the clock count a full 5 seconds before Lydia broke the silence. "Maybe Dad wanted you to have something quiet," she said, and made a small, sympathetic smile that felt like perfume. "You cannot breathe." Daniel did not bother with a smile. He leaned forward, steepled his fingers, and titled his head like a man pretending to be compassionate. "The company will need steady leadership. This is for the best." You know how Dad felt about continuity. Our mother tried to dress the moment with gentle words. "Your father loved all of you," she said, and I saw the tremor in her thumb. Eric stayed neutral, a professional witness to family arithmetic. He slid a set of documents toward each of us. Certified copies, titles, transfer confirmations, the legal end of a life well lived. Daniel had come prepared for a different end. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out another folder, not part of the official stack. He laid it in front of me and tapped once with his pen. "A quitclaim deed," he said. "It will streamline the estate settlement if you transfer that land back to the family trust. We can cut you a check today, $400,000 generous over market, and we avoid the headache of fractional titles." I looked at the paper. Daniel had already filled every line but my signature and the date. The pen he offered was heavy and cold, engraved with his initials. Lydia watched me as if she were watching a show where she already knew the ending. Mom sat very still, a small furrow between her brows. I slid the pen back toward Daniel. "No," I said. "I will keep what Dad left me." The change in the air was immediate. Daniel's jaw worked, once a muscle jumping near his temple. "Marianne, be reasonable. That parcel is a burden, not a gift. We will be the ones mowing weeds and paying taxes while you sit on a field of goat heads. Sign the document." He pushed it an inch closer. I pushed it an inch back. Eric lifted a hand, the kind of measured gesture that says, "We can still be adults here." "Perhaps we take a breath," he said, but Daniel's breath came out sharp. "You have never understood responsibility. Dad gave me the business because he knew I would protect this family. Do not make this harder than it has to be." Lydia laughed once, quiet and bright. She said she wants something quiet. Let her have the field and the crickets. We will handle the real work. I felt my face go still in the way it does when I decide not to rise to a taunt. The office smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper. The clock went on counting. I folded my hands and looked at Eric. "Is there anything else you need from me today?" He shook his head, his gaze cutting between us. "No, Ms. Cole. We are complete for now." When my father was still alive, he liked to walk property lines at dusk. He would point at a tree line and tell me where the water would run in a 100-year storm. He would put 2 fingers against the wind and tell me which way the trucks would choose in 20 years, when a new highway shifted the flow of everything. Some inherit money, others inherit perspective. Only one survives recessions. He said it like a prayer and a warning. Outside the office, the air was thinner and bluer. Daniel followed me into the corridor and stood too close. "Do not be stubborn," he said. "What will you do with a dead farm 2 hours from here?" He did not wait for an answer before walking back inside, already texting someone, his shoulders squared for the next room he would dominate. Lydia brushed past with a whisper of fabric, the scent of something expensive trailing after her. She smiled without her eyes and said, "We will talk at dinner." Mom touched my sleeve and said, "Please be kind to each other." Then she turned away, smaller than I remembered. I drove east with the windows cracked and the radio low. The plains take on a particular gold in late afternoon, the kind that makes even a bar ditch look dignified. The closer I got to Fort Morgan, the fewer the buildings, the broader the sky. When I turned off onto the county road that bordered the property, dust lifted behind the car like unspooling ribbon. The gate hung a little crooked. The fence posts leaned as if they had been listening to wind for too many years. I parked by the old windmill that no longer turned. The field stretched in a ragged rectangle toward a distant line of cottonwoods. Weeds scratched at my shins as I walked. The barn was not a barn anymore, just 3 walls and a roof punctured in 2 places, where last winter's storms had done their work. A hawk traced a slow arc above me. Somewhere a pump kicked on, then off, like a heart remembering and forgetting. I climbed the small rise where the ground lifts enough to see the county road and the ribbon of highway beyond it. In the glove compartment of my car, I kept a canvas envelope full of things my father saved from places like this. Hand-drawn maps with coffee stains. A faded Polaroid of him as a young man beside a truck with the company logo and earlier version bolder font. A folded county plat annotated in pencil. I carried the envelope up the rise and sat in the grass. The wind came up hard and fast, a sudden front shouldering across the flat. The top sheet slid free. I reached and missed. The paper sailed a few yards, flipped twice, and pinned itself against a tuft of foxtail. I walked to it and pressed my palm down to keep it from going again. It was an old topographic map, creased and smudged from years of being opened and closed. Along one edge, my father's handwriting ran neat and sure, the way engineers learn to write. 3 words in a year, blueprint of legacy 2030. No flourish, no explanation, just the quiet certainty of a man who understood that value is often invisible until the ground shifts and reveals it. I read the words again and let them settle into the space behind my ribs. The highway in the distance hummed a low, constant sound like a throat clearing. Trucks moved west and east in an unending line, each one carrying the weight of someone else's math. I kneeled and spread the rest of the papers out, pinning each corner with a rock. There were soil reports clipped with rusted paper fasteners. A photocopy of a letter from the county dated years ago referencing a preliminary corridor study. My father had circled a rectangle that matched the shape of this field and drawn small arrows where he envisioned ingress and egress, where he believed traffic would want to enter and leave if a logistics hub ever made sense here. In the margin, he had written a single note: "Move the fence line 10 feet south before winter." He had not done it. Or maybe he had meant for me to decide. The wind eased. The light shifted from gold to the first tint of evening blue. Somewhere in town, a train horn sounded 2 long notes and a short one. I gathered the papers and slid them back into the envelope, one by one, careful with each crease the way you are careful with a thing that is both map and inheritance. I stood and looked out over the land I had just been told was quiet. It was not quiet. It was holding its breath. On the drive back to Denver, the sky darkened in a way that made the horizon feel closer. I passed a rest area with trucks stacked 3 deep, engines idling, drivers stretched out behind their seats with hats over their eyes. At a gas station outside Brush, I bought coffee that tasted like metal and watched a convoy of flatbeds take the on-ramp, their red lights braided together in the mirror. My phone buzzed twice. A message from Lydia that said dinner at 7 and a second from a number I did not recognize offering to purchase the Fort Morgan parcel at a slight premium with expedited close. I put the phone face down on the passenger seat and drove. By the time the city lights rose up in a glaze, I had made only one decision. I would not sell the land. I would walk it again at dawn and again at dusk and learn where the water gathered after a storm and how the wind lifted in spring. I would find out why my father wrote those 3 words and a year in the margin of a map and what he saw that day when he steadied his hand and imagined a future I could not yet name. Chapter 2. The hidden clause. I was back in Eric Vaughn's office before the building's coffee cart opened. He arrived with a paper cup and a stack of folders, set them down, and said we should read the will line by line. The room still held a trace of last night's lemon polish, the same careful scent that had watched my family become arithmetic. Eric slid a certified copy toward me and tapped a page halfway through. Clause 14, he said, legacy provision. He read aloud in the steady cadence lawyers use when they need words to land. The beneficiary who creates measurable and sustainable value using the asset bequeathed within 3 years of probate shall receive an additional distribution from the Cole Legacy Trust in an amount determined by the trustees. He scanned the trustee addendum and looked up. 20 million, he said. Your father left the number sealed, then unsealed it before he signed. Heat moved through my chest in a slow wave. It was not shock, it was recognition. My father had built one last test and buried it in the middle of the calmest paragraph. I leaned over the page and traced the margin with a finger, the same way he would trace a lot line before deciding where a road should bend. 3 years, I said. Eric nodded. The clock starts from probate. September of 2020. You have until September of 2023 to demonstrate value that is real and durable. I heard Daniel's voice in my head telling me to sign the quitclaim and accept the easy check. I heard Lydia's silk laugh as if money were a mirror held up to her best angle. I pressed my hands flat on the table and said, I will not sell. Eric nodded again, as if he had already known. Then we had work to do, he said. He wrote a short list in clean block letters. Title work, zoning, infrastructure, adjacent use. He paused and added one more word. Corridors. By October, Lydia was filming long weekend videos in the Lakeview kitchen about wellness rituals and the joy of a fresh start. She leased a pearl-white electric SUV and posted 2 photos a day from places with marble floors. Daniel began calling it a new era for coal development and joined 2 angel groups that loved the word disruption. He sent me a link for a token offering I did not open. In January of 2021, he told the family chat he had doubled an investment in 6 weeks. In April, he stopped sending numbers. In May, our mother asked if I had spoken to him because he sounded tired. I spent the first months how my father taught me to spend a first pass. I drove the county roads in every direction from the property. I watched the morning light along the eastern fence and the afternoon light along the western ditch. I pulled deeds and plats at the clerk and recorder and read the minutes of the county commission on a tablet at my kitchen table past midnight. The words corridor and freight and interchange kept appearing like faint tracks in dust. One morning, I paid for a subscription to a transportation digest and fell into a thread about a multi-state push to reroute freight traffic away from choke points. There was talk of an interstate freight corridor study, and the years 2021 through 2025 were written as if they were a long inhale. I made an appointment with a planner at the State Department of Transportation. He talked about freight tonnage and the economics of minutes saved, and the way land use needs to anticipate flow before flow makes a mess of land use. He did not promise anything, and he did not need to. I left with a public docket number written on a sticky note and 2 phrases I could not unhear: preliminary alignment and strategic hub potential. On a cold Saturday, I drove back to the field and parked by the windmill. The canvas envelope was on the seat beside me. I carried it to the old tack room where my father kept a ruined metal box full of the kinds of things men think they might need one day. I tipped the box onto a dusty bench and shook out a handful of bolts, a faded truck registration, and an envelope sealed with old cellophane tape. Inside was my father's handwriting again. He had sketched the rectangle of this land with the highway, a thin line at the base, and a thicker line where he imagined a new road might want to live. At the bottom of the page, he had written a single sentence. The real wealth is what you can build from nothing. I read it twice, then I read it again while the light slid through a shingle gap and made a pale bar across the page. It did not feel like sentiment. It felt like permission. I put the sketch back into the envelope and set it on the bench where I could see it. Then I called Eric and asked for an introduction to a corporate formation service he trusted. He sent 3 names. I picked one and filed for a new company with a name that sounded like steel moving in one direction: Coal Freight Nexus, LLC. I signed the articles and a banking resolution and a registered agent appointment. I opened an account with a number that began with a 0 and felt like a seed. Next, I built a list of the people I would need. A civil engineer who had drawn 100 site plans and bored of telling clients what they wanted to hear. A logistics designer who understood where trucks would stack and where they would not. A contractor who could put steel upright in winter. I asked a friend in Seattle for a name and he gave me Renee Dalton. He said she was blunt in the way that saves you money. I called her on a Tuesday afternoon. She answered on the second ring. "This is Renee." I told her who I was and what I had and what I believed the next 3 years might ask of me. She listened without interrupting and then asked for data. I sent her every map and docket reference I had collected, even the penciled sketch with my father's note. She called back the next morning. "You are early," she said, "and early is the only way this works. If you want a real shot at a hub, we need entitlements lined up and preliminary designs ready before the corridor study hardens. Can you keep this quiet while we move?" I told her quiet had become my first language. We signed a non-disclosure agreement the following week. Eric reviewed it and said it was tighter than most. I wired a retainer to Renee's firm and flew to Seattle for a meeting in a conference room with walls covered in topo maps and whiteboards that smelled like solvent. We spent 6 hours erasing and drawing and erasing again. Truck counts, turning radii, staging lanes, drainage ponds. An on-site diesel alternative plan to satisfy a future-minded commissioner who would ask for it. When I left, it was raining, the kind of fine rain that seems to hover before deciding where to fall. Renee walked me to the elevator and said one more thing. "You need a narrative for your permits, not just numbers. A why that sounds like work and jobs and safety. Can you carry that in your voice without blinking?" "Yes," I said. By spring, we had a preliminary site plan and a list of every neighbor we needed to meet before they heard rumors and decided those rumors were facts. I drove the loop and knocked on doors with a box of donuts in my arms. I listened more than I spoke. I wrote down every concern and promised to come back with specifics. Each night, I sent Renee a summary. Each morning, she sent me a revised plan that bent toward what could be approved. Eric handled a quiet application for a conditional use permit and asked me to be patient while the county moved at the pace of paper. In June, I sat across from Daniel at a steakhouse where the servers wore crisp white shirts. He cut his meat into perfect squares and told me he had executed a bridge financing that would change the trajectory of the company for a generation. He asked where I stood with the land and whether I was ready to be done with it and get back to real life. I told him I was not ready to be done with it. He smiled the way men smile when they think you will come around once you see how tired you are. Lydia sent me a link that night to a video where she described the quiet joy of simplifying. She filmed it in Lakeview with a bouquet of pale peonies behind her and a gold watch on her wrist. In August, Renee flew to Denver and we drove to Fort Morgan before dawn. We stood in a rectangle of dirt where the site office would sit and watched a line of trucks move along the highway, red lights stretching until they merged with the horizon. She held her coffee in both hands and said, "This is the right place if the corridor falls the way I think it will. You cannot control that, but you can be ready to catch it." She pointed to the high ground and the shallow swale and described how water would move in a spring storm. I felt my father's voice under hers, not as a ghost, but as muscle memory. We ordered the site office a steel container fitted with a door and a window, and a heater strong enough to compete with the wind. On the first night after it was delivered, Renee and I sat inside on folding chairs with a single lamp between us. The metal pinged as it cooled. Outside, the wind slid along the walls and made a low, steady sound like a held note. Renee said they wanted land. I wanted leverage. Her mouth lifted at one corner. "You will get both if you keep your head," she said. I kept my head while permits creaked through committees and engineers lined up soil tests, and the bank signed off on a construction line with covenants that would have strangled a different project. We hired a firm in Greeley to pour the first slabs and a crew that knew how to set steel without talking too much. The county posted the permit approval on a Tuesday afternoon. By Thursday, we had a fence around the site and a sign with a name that still felt like a secret spoken aloud. Coal Freight Nexus. Trucks on the highway slowed as drivers tried to read it in a single glance. At sunrise the next day, the first bulldozer arrived, yellow paint dulled by years of work. The operator climbed down, shook my hand, and asked where I wanted the cut to begin. I pointed to the stake Renee had set at the southeast corner. He nodded, climbed back into the cab, and turned the key. The engine woke with a growl that felt like the first sentence of a story finally written. He lowered the blade and pushed forward. Dirt lifted and rolled a dark wave, parting and laying itself down in a new line. Wind gathered and carried the smell of earth across the field and out toward the highway. The ground they mocked was about to move under their feet. Chapter 3. The Greed Spiral. By winter, the site had a heartbeat. Rebar rose from the frost like ribs concrete set in white breath, and steel crews moved with the practiced rhythm of people who trust their hands. Trucks began to edge along the shoulder by the fence to look through the chain link. I kept a notebook in my pocket and wrote down everything that could go wrong so we could prevent half of it. In January of 2022, Daniel called and asked if I could meet him in his office. The windows looked over the same streets our grandfather had walked when he sold his first lots. Daniel stood with his back to the glass and spoke like a man who needed the horizon to agree with him. He said he had a series of high-velocity deals lined up: a bridge finance here, a structured token there, a startup that would own urban last-mile distribution. He paced while he talked, and every sentence ended with the word scale. Then he smiled and said the bank loved him, but balance sheets loved collateral more. He wanted to pledge a portion of his shares to a quiet fund that would not spook the board. I watched him pour water into a glass and not drink it. He asked if I knew anyone who liked yield without headlines. I told him yield adored headlines more than men admitted. He laughed and said he was serious. I said I would make a call. That night, I opened a file on my laptop and reviewed a term sheet I had prepared months earlier in case this exact moment arrived. NorthRock Holdings sat 3 floors below a bank address on 17th Street, a fund of funds that existed to buy time and charge fairly for it. Its ownership ran through 2 shells and a trust administered by a woman in Omaha who never asked questions without answers attached. Eric had grumbled about the layers until I reminded him of Daniel's appetite for shortcuts. We filed the lien the following week. 60% of Daniel's voting shares stood in a row behind signatures and seals. The covenants were simple: perform or forfeit. By spring, the shine had worn off Daniel's deals. Crypto charts look like grace until they look like gravity. The startup missed 2 milestones and began releasing updates composed mostly of adjectives. The bridge financing needed a bridge. In April, he demanded a renegotiation of his covenants. NorthRock declined with courteous words and a copy of Section 6. He stopped returning my texts for a while. Lydia's fall was louder. A reporter in Boulder published a piece on donor intent and the charity she fronted called Women for Change. Screenshots followed. Vendor invoices routed through a lifestyle company that turned out to be her husband's travel, labeled as outreach, a speaking honorarium paid to herself through a management entity with a name designed to look like a foundation. Her sponsors paused campaigns. Comments on her channels went from hearts to questions to knives. She posted a video with a white sweater and red eyes and said she had made administrative mistakes, then took it down. At Sunday dinner, our mother set plates on the table and tried to keep her voice steady. Daniel arrived late and spoke first. He told Lydia she had torched the family name. Lydia told Daniel he had been playing roulette with the only thing Dad trusted him with. They went back and forth while the roast cooled. I poured water past the salt and wrote a line in my notebook. People blame loudest where they fear most. Our mother looked at me with a plea I did not know how to answer. After dinner, she caught me by the sink and asked whether there was anything I could do. I said time might be kinder than we expect if we let it work. She nodded and squeezed my hand and looked older by a year. In June, Lydia called me just after 9 on a Tuesday. She did not say hello. She said Daniel is drowning and I cannot fix this and everyone is watching. She took a breath that sounded like the brake on a car going downhill. She asked if I would talk to whoever held his shares and negotiate a release and save the family name. I stood at the window of the site office and watched a cement truck back into position. The driver rolled down his window and waved. I said softly that it was not my place to fix what greed broke. Silence held for 3 beats. Lydia said, "I thought you were the compassionate one." I said, "I still am. I will not humiliate him. I will not save him from learning." She hung up without goodbye. By late summer, the questions began to circle around NorthRock. A business reporter named Michael Reyes left a message asking for comment on a fund acquiring controlling interests in family companies across the Front Range. He sounded young and relentless. He emailed 3 times with polite persistence. Eric advised silence. Renee said journalists smelled blood before the first drop hit the ground. I drafted a sentence that said nothing and never sent it. On the site, we moved from slab to steel. The skeleton of the first warehouse cast long angled shadows across the dirt at 5 in the afternoon. From the highest platform, you could see the curve of the interstate, the red lights like beads on a wire at dusk. I stood there some evenings and counted trucks until the numbers calmed me. When the wind hit right, it carried a mix of scents, diesel, and cut dirt and hot paint that smelled like the inside of my grandfather's old workshop. Michael found his way to Fort Morgan one day and stood at the fence with a notebook. He introduced himself and asked if he could ask a few questions. I said he just had. He laughed and asked why the name on the sign matched the name in two separate permit applications for an auxiliary freight staging area positioned exactly where the state study suggested it might one day be needed. I told him I was building what the land was willing to hold. He asked whether NorthRock had any connection to me. I looked at the steel rising behind him and said I was connected to a lot of things that had my name on them. He wrote something down and thanked me for my time and told me that quiet was a story too if people stared long enough. Daniel's calls resumed when his deadlines approached. The first one came late on a Friday. He wanted to know who was behind NorthRock and what price they wanted to get out of his life. I told him the terms were the terms. He said he would go to court and blow the whole thing up. I told him the covenants were clean and that courts enjoyed paperwork more than tantrums. He hung up after calling me a name he would regret later. In September, the board at Coal Development convened an emergency session. Half the faces were anxious, 2 looked angry, and 1 looked like a man who had already decided to leave. Daniel tried to present a refinance package that relied on a valuation no one believed. Lydia sat in the back with dark glasses and a scarf as if she were hiding from light. When the lenders asked about pledged shares, Daniel spoke in circles. At the break, he cornered me by the coffee urn and said I could end this with a phone call. I asked him to show me the bridge that would make the numbers true. He stared at me until his eyes went unfocused. The next morning, Michael published a piece that did not mention me by name, but might as well have. It traced filings across 3 states, noted the lien positions, and quoted an analyst who said NorthRock had outplayed a family firm at its own game. Daniel called and left a voicemail that began as anger and collapsed into something like pleading. Our mother called and asked whether the family could meet for dinner without business on the table. I said yes and brought flowers. At dinner, no one ate much. Daniel stared at a spot beyond the wall. Lydia picked at a salad and asked how long public memory lasts when the next scandal is always 1 scroll away. Mom asked what would happen to the people who worked at the company if everything fell apart. I said there were ways to keep doors open even when names on the door changed. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded as if she had heard what I had not said. Back at the site, a fall storm blew through and left the air rinsed. The crews bolted the last cross brace on the south end, and for the first time the building felt like a promise, not a plan. I climbed the stairs to the top platform and stood with one hand on a steel column while semis pulled east along the interstate. Their lights moved in patient lines, each driver hauling someone else's timeline to someone else's dock. My voice in my own head sounded level and far away. They thought I was quiet because I was weak. I was listening to the sound of their empire cracking. 3 weeks later, the headlines arrived like a weather front. Coal development faces liquidity crisis. Emergency board vote this week. Lenders review options. 2 days after that, another alert hit my phone and then another. The first was a business wire. The second was Michael's piece with more color and sharper verbs. He quoted 2 anonymous sources who said a mysterious investor had secured a controlling stake through pledged shares and was expected to consolidate ownership if the company defaulted. I sat in the site office with a mug of coffee gone cold and watched a line of dump trucks idle along the fence while a loader moved earth from one pile to another like a machine rewriting history 1 bucket at a time. My phone buzzed with the string of texts I did not open. Renee slid into the chair opposite me and raised her eyebrows in a question. I lifted the mug and spoke softly to no one and to the room and to the past. Funny how the family business found its way back to family. Chapter 4. The Court of Consequences. The motion papers arrived on a gray Thursday in late October, the kind of morning that makes the city sound smaller. Daniel had filed in Denver County Court to void the liens and unwind the pledge. He claimed fraud and bad faith by NorthRock Holdings and asked for an emergency injunction to restore his voting control. Eric read the petition twice and slid it across my kitchen table. He asked how quiet I wanted to stay. I said quiet until quiet no longer served the truth. 2 weeks later, we took the elevator to the 5th floor and stepped into a corridor where the carpet had learned 1,000 worries. The courtroom was cool and framed in blonde wood. Judge Elaine Turner sat high behind a clean bench, a woman who looked like she had read every line of every file and did not mistake volume for merit. Daniel sat at plaintiff counsel table in a dark suit and a tighter jaw. Lydia slipped into a back pew with large sunglasses and a scarf pulled close even though no one cared what she wore anymore. Michael Reyes was 3 rows behind her with a notebook and a face that gave nothing away. Daniel's attorney opened with confidence that sounded practiced. He painted NorthRock as a shadow fund that preyed on a family in transition, that hid behind layers to seize control, that pushed a successful company toward the brink to collect its pound of flesh. He called the covenants predatory. He called the timing malicious. He kept saying family as if it could turn a contract into a wish. Eric waited for his turn with a stillness that lets a room settle. When he rose, he asked the court to take judicial notice of the pledge agreements and the board minutes where Daniel had approved them. He walked the judge through section by section the performance thresholds, the cure periods, the notices of default that had gone unanswered. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The paper spoke in its own weight. By midday, the hearing turned on a single question. Who owned NorthRock? Daniel's attorney pointed at the space where a person should be and demanded disclosure. He said the court could not allow a ghost to hold a company hostage. He asked the judge to compel the identity of the beneficial owner. Eric did not move. He said NorthRock would respond to any direct order of the court, but he also reminded the court that beneficial ownership had no bearing on whether a contract had been breached. He let that hang until the judge leaned forward and asked if NorthRock would answer the question. He said yes when the court asked it directly. Judge Turner looked at Daniel's attorney, then at Eric, then down at the file. She said the question was now relevant to a full and fair record. She asked who owned NorthRock Holdings. Eric turned his head to me. I felt the room shift. I rose and stepped to the lectern. The microphone carried my voice farther than I expected. That would be me, Your Honor. The sound in the gallery was a breath taken all at once. Daniel's face flushed the color of old bricks. Lydia's hand went to her mouth and stayed there. Michael looked down and wrote 4 words in a quick, vertical stack. Daniel stood as if pulled by a string. He said I had set him up. He said I had lied to my own blood. He said no court should allow such treachery to stand. Judge Turner lifted a palm and told him to address the bench or sit down. He sat down, breathing like he had run far uphill. Eric placed a binder on the evidence cart. He asked permission to approach and handed a copy to the clerk. He said the court would find in tab 1 the original pledge agreement signed by Mr. Cole with counsel present tab 2, the notices of default tab 3, the board resolutions acknowledging the lien tab 4, the escrow instructions. He said tabs 5 through 8 contained the financials of Coal Freight Nexus and coal development during the relevant period, and tab 9 was an attestation by the trustees of the Coal Legacy Trust regarding clause 14 of the will. Judge Turner read as if the room had slowed to accommodate her. Then she asked me to explain not in legalese what I had done. I told her I had used a lawful financial instrument to stabilize a company in free fall. I told her the liens were public, the notices were timely, and the cure periods had expired without cure. I told her the intention was not to destroy but to preserve. When she asked whether I had profited, I told her yes at market rates for risk that no one else would carry. When she asked whether I had used the asset I inherited to create value, I handed the court a simple page. It listed revenue of $42 million over the last 4 quarters for Coal Freight Nexus, audited and verified. It listed jobs created at 1,200 with payroll taxes and benefits paid to the cent. It listed signed contracts for logistics services with companies the judge had heard of. It listed a letter from the trustees of the Coal Legacy Trust affirming that the clause had been satisfied within 3 years and that a $20 million distribution had been authorized. Eric kept his hands on the table while I spoke. He knew a thing close is cleaner when the person with the most to lose is the one who says the lines that matter. Daniel's attorney tried to argue intent again, but intent is a thin reed in a river of paper. He tried to suggest coercion, but the signatures lined up like train cars. He tried to suggest I had owed Daniel a disclosure because we were family, but the judge asked him to show her the statute that made kinship a term of art in secured transactions. He could not. Daniel stood and asked to speak. The judge allowed it because some storms must blow through to be done. He said I had stolen everything that meant anything to him, and that our father would be ashamed of me. He was breathing hard and sweating at the temples. He said I had turned our legacy into a table of numbers. He called me a word he had not used since we were teenagers. When he ran out of air, the room was very quiet. I kept my voice even. No, you sold everything. I just knew what it was worth. Judge Turner looked down at the file again and then at both tables. She summarized what she had before her. A valid pledge of shares in exchange for real money to fund real obligations. Uncured defaults. A lawful transfer of control pursuant to agreed covenants. A separate but related record of substantial value created by the beneficiary of a bequest in fulfillment of a clause her father had written. She said courts do not rewrite contracts because a party regrets them. She denied Daniel's petition and confirmed the liens and the transfer of voting control. She directed the clerk to enter judgment accordingly. She noted for the record the trustee letter and the amount of the trust distribution. She did not smile. She did not need to. Lydia remained in her seat while the room emptied. Our mother was not there. Michael closed his notebook and waited by the door. Daniel stayed at counsel table with his head in his hands until his attorney touched his shoulder and whispered. He rose without looking at me and walked out the side door reserved for counsel, the way people leave when they cannot bear the faces in a hallway. Outside the courthouse steps were a shoal and a fast river. Cameras clicked, microphones appeared, questions stacked. I do not know how news crews move that quickly, only that they do. Eric stepped to my side and said we did not need to say anything. I took one more breath of thin fall air and walked into the small circle that had formed with me at the center. Michael spoke first because he had arrived before the others and had the decency to give his voice a little drop at the end of sentences. He asked if NorthRock had been conceived from the start to take control of coal development. I said NorthRock had been conceived to price risk correctly and follow paper. He asked if this was revenge. The other microphones leaned in. No, it was restoration. Cameras kept clicking even after the words went quiet. A woman asked if I had anything to say to the employees of coal development. I said I had said it with payroll. A man asked whether I intended to keep Daniel on in any capacity. I said that would be handled by a board process and did not look at Eric because I already knew the answer. Michael asked what Clause 14 had meant to me when I first read it. I said it had felt like a compass. The wind shifted and sent a line of dry leaves skittering along the stone. Lydia stood at the edge of the crowd with her scarf in her hands, eyes red but dry. For a moment our gazes met. She nodded once, small and tired, and turned away. The courthouse doors closed behind her with a hush that swallowed the sound of the street for a heartbeat. Eric touched my elbow and guided me down the steps. The afternoon light had the slant of ending. Across the plaza, a flock of pigeons lifted and turned as one, then settled again as if nothing had happened. A siren wailed somewhere on Colfax and faded. In my pocket, my phone vibrated with a message from the trustees that the wire had landed. I did not look at the amount. The number did not change what had already been decided here. We reached the car. Eric opened the passenger door and waited. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was exactly as all right as the truth allows. He nodded and closed me in. I sat with my hands on my knees and watched a line of clouds stack along the Rockies until the edges went gold. Chapter 5. The Legacy Rebuilt. The morning the doors opened at Coal Freight Nexus began with frost on the grass and a clear white sky that felt like a promise. Crews had washed the concrete and wiped every railing until steel shone like water. Flags ran along the fence line. A portable stage faced the loading bays where a row of new dock doors stood ready like teeth in a smile. Trucks idled along the shoulder, waiting for the signal to roll through the gate for the first time. I walked the perimeter with a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold and tried to hold the whole picture in my head. Gravel, concrete, steel payroll families. A shape my father had traced in pencil, now standing where wind once had the only say. Renee found me by the south gate with her clipboard tucked under her arm. She had a scarf around her neck and a grin that started in her eyes. She tapped the face of her watch and said it was showtime. I laughed in a way that did not feel like defense for the first time in years. We made our way to the ribbon, where a pair of oversized scissors waited on a linen-covered table. Staff lined the dock apron in high-visibility vests. A handful of neighbors I had met with donuts and folded maps stood near the front. County commissioners shifted from foot to foot and tried to look less like speeches than they were. The logo we had argued over for weeks glowed against the blue of the Colorado sky. Coal Freight Nexus. No flourish, just the name and the work. Our mother had a seat on the front row with a blanket tucked across her knees. When I stepped down from the stage to hug her, she held my hand for a moment longer than usual and looked past me at the building as if she were arranging a memory on a shelf. She said she could hear my father's voice when the trucks downshifted on the on-ramp. Then she patted my cheek and smiled, and I saw the young woman she had been when the first coal sign went up on a block no one wanted to buy. The county said a few words. A state planner I recognized from a windowless room in Denver talked about tonnage and interconnected economies and the dignity of logistics when people do it right. Michael Reyes stood off to the side with a small camera crew and the same notebook he had carried into court. He did not interrupt, he watched. Renee and I stepped to the ribbon together. She whispered that I should do the honors. I said we built it together, and I meant it. We each took one handle of the scissors. The blades felt heavier than they looked. I counted under my breath. 3. The cut made a dry, soft sound, and the ribbon fell like rain. Air horns answered from the trucks, and a cheer rolled down the line of dock doors, caught the corner of the building, and echoed back brighter. The first tractor-trailer eased forward a blue rig with a driver who had been early to every meeting we held about safety. He pulled past the stage and up to Bay 1. The dock light changed from red to green, and the driver stepped down and shook my hand. He said he had been hauling since he was 19, and that this was the first time he had seen a site plan that matched the way trucks actually moved. He smiled like a man whose shoulders had dropped a little. I told him we had listened. He said he could tell. On the north wall near the office, we had mounted a bronze plaque in a simple frame. The font was clean, and the metal caught the morning light. Legacy is not what you inherit, it is what you build. I traced the edge with my finger the way I had traced the margin of a map. When my mother read the words, she pressed her lips together and nodded, as if something inside her had clicked back into place. Then she looked at me, and her voice broke just a little. Your father would have been proud, Marianne. We stood there for a long breath while noise swelled and dropped around us. For a second, I saw my father walk the line with his hands in his jacket pockets, and his head turned to catch the sound of a trailer backing in. Then he was gone again, and the sound was only this day and these people. I helped my mother back to her seat and told her there would be shade inside when she needed it. She said she liked the cold on her face. Lydia and Daniel did not come. The invitations had been sent without expectation. A neighbor told me she had seen a moving truck outside Lydia's place a month earlier, and a realtor's sign planted near a newly trimmed hedge. An old colleague said he had heard Daniel had gone west, maybe Reno, maybe Fresno somewhere. He could start a smaller thing without the weight of the family name. I did not feel triumph. I felt the ache of something healed badly in an earlier season, and the acceptance that not every bone mends straight. After the ribbon, we held the first session of Women in Freight in the break room we had turned into a lecture hall with a projector and decent coffee. 50 chairs all full. The women who came wore work boots and pencil skirts and everything in between. A dispatcher who had lost her job when a warehouse closed in Greeley. A former hospitality manager ready to learn routing. A welder who had been told a dozen times that the shop floor was not a place for her. Renee opened with a slide that was mostly numbers, and I followed with the why. Not the speech kind, but the kind that lives in your back and your hands when you pick something up because it is yours to carry. We offered paid apprenticeships and guaranteed interviews and childcare stipends that did not ask people to perform gratitude. The county commissioner, who had once demanded proof of benefits, raised her hand and said the program would be eligible for a match. A woman in the second row wiped her eyes and laughed and said she had not cried in a freight building before. Another asked if she could bring her sister next time. I said bring your sister and your neighbor and anyone who has been told they are too much or not enough. When the session ended, Michael asked for 5 minutes on camera. He ran through the facts with the ease of someone who read fast and remembered faster. Revenue rolled in, jobs posted, contracts signed. Then he lowered the mic a fraction and asked what this place meant to me beyond the numbers. I told him it was the answer to a pencil line my father drew when no one else could see the picture. He turned back to the camera and spoke in the measured cadence he used when he wanted the words to carry. She turned betrayal into backbone. She rebuilt a dynasty on integrity. The afternoon widened. Trucks settled into a tempo, forklifts hummed. Two kids from the neighborhood pressed their noses to the office glass and laughed when a dock light flipped from red to green. My mother asked someone to take her picture in front of the plaque. Renee walked the staging lanes and made small adjustments with her foreman that would save minutes a day and weeks a year. I stood on the edge where the gravel meets the road and listened to the place become itself. As the sun tilted toward the front range, the mountains came up like a cut paper silhouette. The light went thin and gold. The wind softened and carried a clean scent from the newly poured concrete mixed with cut grass. I thought of the line my father had written in that ruined tack room. The real wealth is what you can build from nothing. I thought of the other line he had left without saying the one I had learned by doing. Hold the door for the next person in line. I walked to the edge of the property and looked back at the building. The logo glowed faintly now, less declaration than heartbeat. Somewhere a train blew a long, steady note. A hawk lifted off the top of the light pole and drifted toward the river. Margaret Cole sat in a folding chair with the blanket still on her lap and watched a truck ease into Bay 7 with the calm interest of someone cataloging something for later. I felt tired in the good way that arrives after finishing the work you promised to do. Money did not destroy my family. It only revealed who we already were. If you have ever been underestimated or pushed aside, remember that you do not have to fight loud to win. Sometimes the quietest success speaks the loudest. If this story found a piece of you, tell me what part of it felt true, share your own turning point, and stay with us for the next chapter.